co-edited this a volume with Adrian Bua. And so Adrian and I are going to give a brief overview of the volume to kick off this webinar. But first, I want to really thank Dio and the PDD Group and People Powered for organizing this event, and Greta as well for offering to provide some reflection and comments at the end. So next slide. So the book provides an analysis of social movement-led processes for democratization across different contexts. And we were interested in understanding better how these movements are reclaiming and reinventing the deliberative and participatory toolbox to widen the scope and the reach of democracy. And so we ask what occurs when these progressive social movements are involved in shaping the institutionalization of participatory governance processes. And the contribution to the volume reflect on the potential of these initiatives, but also their limitation, how they emerge and what happens when they are implemented and clash with existing political, economic, and legal frameworks. So the chapter presented today in particular nicely situate the democratic innovations within a broader conceptual discourse of political economy and the impact of the neoliberal political economy on participation. Next slide, please. So progressive social movements and grassroots groups have always contributed to both participatory and deliberative innovations, not just through protests for political demands, but also through the direct production of collective goods, for instance, through forms of mutual help and service delivery or experimentation with communitarian lifestyles. And so we positioned the book in relation to different literatures: social movements, participatory and deliberative democracy, the commons. And Adrian and I developed the concept of democracy-driven governance, which we first introduced in a paper that we published in 2021 on the European Journal of Political Research. And democracy-driven governance becomes the analytical frame underpinning this volume. And the different chapters test and develop the concept across different geographical and policy and socioeconomic contexts. Next slide. So what is democracy-driven governance? It really describes the kinds of participatory projects that arise when social movements engage with participatory deliberative institutional design as part of their strategy to reclaim the state. And Nick, actually, I was rereading your chapter, Nick, and it puts it really nicely in his chapter about cases in Toronto. And he says, politics from the lens of democracy-driven governance is about power relations and social struggles. And participatory governance comes from tipping points won by social action. Next slide. And like democracy-driven governance, we conceptualized it also as a counterpoint to Mark Warren's concept of governance-driven democratization. It sounds a bit like a tongue twister, but governance-driven democratization refers to those democratic innovation mostly initiated by the state, by public agency or the democratic sector, to respond to specific governance and policy issues. And so governance-driven democratization has a strong pragmatic problem-solving orientation, and it really opens up opportunities for practical influence of citizens on specific issues and policies. But, and in this, similarly to the use of the arts as part of public engagement, as Lucy will discuss later when presenting her chapter, the emancipatory outcomes of these state-led democratic innovations are often claimed without any critical analysis or much critical analysis of the wider neoliberal context in which these processes exist and are increasingly incorporated. And so democracy-driven governance, our response, really places the emphasis on the political economy of participation. As social movements learn and renew the participatory toolbox, they are also developing new forms of democratic participation that widen the scope of participation from strictly political and policy institutions to the economy and wider society. And this is why the book really reflects on the role of the commons as well, which in a way also contribute to grounding the protest politics of social movements in the daily experience of activism, and therefore bring a pragmatic orientation compared to prefigurative politics and protest politics. And in this way, many of the democracy-driven governance experiences that we also explore in the book offer societal and economic alternatives to current governance models underpinned by liberal institutions and the neoliberal economy. And in their encounter with the state, they develop different strategies and tactics beyond just the agonistic repertoire of protest politics. And I think Paola's chapter here really reflects on the collaborative countervailing power that social movements can help play in participatory governance. Now, we're not claiming that one form, like governance-driven democratization, is bad, or democracy-driven governance is good. They both exist in a dynamic relationship, and they interact with different spaces and forms of participation, as you can also see in the diagram on the slide. So they shouldn't be seen as a simple bottom-up versus top-down heuristic either, because they also have much in common. They both attempt to foster participatory governance, so to include citizens in the working of public administration through institutionalized and routinized participation. And they're not static spaces, because the sort of social movements claimed democracy-driven governance spaces can also become closed spaces through assimilation or co-optation, and vice versa. Governance-driven democratization spaces can generate new fields of power that open new democratic possibilities. And next slide. So democracy-driven governance really, the difference is really this emphasis also on the political economy of participation, and the bridging between theories of participatory democracy and radical democratic theory. So it's both a form of participation by eruption, so to speak, that establishes the centrality of collectives in an oppositional stance to the state, but also seeking to engage with and influence the state by reclaiming the practice of participatory governance. And I'm gonna bring in my colleague and co-editor Adrian here, and he's gonna, we can move to the next slide, and Adrian is gonna talk you through the main themes of the book.
Yeah, thanks. So the inspiration for the paper that Sonia mentioned, where we sort of map out, define the idea of DDG and map out how it relates to other forms of politics and democratic activity seen in the previous slide. It came from the inspiration came from the Spanish radical municipalism and its use of participatory public administration. In the paper, we focus specifically on the case of Barcelona, where we trace out dynamism between the formation of a governance-driven democracy regime in the 80s and its change into a democracy-driven governance regime after the global financial crash, and as sort of movement parties moved into the state. So this was a conjunctural moment linked to a crisis. And in our reconstruction of the case of Barcelona, we identify as the main tipping point the austerity politics and the anti-austerity movements that gave rise to, which opened the window for the development of DDG. We also focus in the book in terms on the challenges and constraints that DDG is sort of faced by. Sorry, this is in the paper. Sorry, the Spanish state was broadly hostile to DDG as it sought to roll out austerity measures throughout the 2010s, which is clearly antithetical to DDG's sort of ambition to expand the scope of democracy. But we leave the question open in this paper as to whether DDG can develop in other contexts, and we invite further research and theoretical refinement on modalities of radicalization and social movement-led participatory governance. And this is where the book comes in, right? So this is the concern that we departed with, and the different contributions reflect on how DDG travels to other cases and contexts, to what extent the concept of DDG captures related developments in radicalization and the interface of participatory governance and social movements, and the lessons that we can take from different contexts in terms of the conditions of possibility, limits to, and opportunities opened by DDG. And in the conclusion, Gianpaolo Baiocchi identifies this cross-cutting theme as, I think, if I remember correctly, domain-specific constraining and enabling features. Next slide. Yeah, are we on the next one? Sorry, I can't see. Yeah, so Sonia covered the key themes. The introduction basically sort of reintroduces what me and Sonia just sort of talked about. I won't go over that again. And then following this, the book is divided into three sections. So the first section, which we can see on the slide, is composed of more theoretical chapters that reflect on different aspects of DDG and extend and refine the concept in various ways. So Danica Flois kicks us off by engaging social movement-driven participatory governance, or DDG, with Habermasian deliberative theory, arguing that it can sort of serve to re-inject the role of sort of contention into the deliberative theoretical sort of space. And here with us today, Nick Vlaus analyzes and compares cases of DDG and GDD in Toronto using commodification and decommodification, as a litmus test for their democratizing capacity. And he'll talk about that later. Then a chapter by Marcus Holdo develops the concept of democratic care and its contradictions and tensions in a chapter that also speaks a lot to this dynamism at a more micro level. So in terms of how participants don't necessarily adopt the roles that institutional designers imagine that they might adopt, but they might sort of resist those roles and create new ones. And he focuses on feminist literatures on care and applies that to democracy, arguing that care and democratic care exists in a tense relationship with neoliberalism, because a care ethic is obviously against the sort of commercialized ethic of neoliberalism, but at the same time, it can provide the sort of social tissue that any social system needs to survive, which neoliberalism also depletes. So there's a contradiction there that he nicely brings out. And then finally, Henk, who is with us today, I think as well, identifies different transformative modalities of democracy that alongside DDG provide a repertoire of democratic reform, and he refers to the concept of the democratic multiverse in this respect. Next slide, please. So a second, more empirical section analyzes the emergence of DDG-like processes throughout the world. And as you can see, the chapters include a geographical focus on Spain, France, Brazil, Greenland, Portugal, and themes covering climate change adaptation, participatory arts, which we'll hear about today, urban governance, anti-colonialism, and collective candidacies in Brazil. So Lucy will talk to us about her chapter on social movements and participatory arts as spaces for prefiguration and democratic renewal, in a chapter that also touches upon many things, but also touches upon the tensions which participatory arts faces as it interacts with neoliberalism. Next slide, please. The final section focuses on obstacles and challenges and themes cut across online democracy, and technopopulism, citizen asset transfer, and the relationship between social movement activists and participatory institutions. There is the focus is mainly on Spain, with one chapter on France, and this is mainly because it's in the Spanish experience in which DDG is the most advanced to date, or where there is a greater degree of historical experience. So we have chapters analyzing different parts of the engagement of the new municipalism with participatory governance, and the kinds of sort of challenges faced as they try to implement these new initiatives. Next slide. And then finally, Giampaolo Baiocchi, one of the pioneers of the analysis of social movements and participatory institutions, in his early work on Porto Alegre, reflects on the research agenda that democracy-driven governance sort of launches, arguing that it's productively situated in what he calls the messy middle between political economy accounts that are too focused on structure and constraint, and normative theoretical accounts with too much faith in the ability of institutional design to meet democratic objectives. You could say it's sort of between structuralism and voluntarism, if we want to talk in those terms. And he concludes by arguing that it's by continuing to focus on this messy middle that academic work can help broader and deepen democracy, which is the project that DDG, and I guess most of us here in this room, so to speak, are concerned with. That's the overview of the book.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to stop sharing that, and I will hand over to Nick.
Thanks for that introduction, and glad to be here with everybody. Just want to say thanks to Sonia and Adrian for the opportunity to be a part of the volume. It's definitely helped with thinking through some of the ways that I've been trying to conceptualize democratic innovations from a critical political economy point of view. I also want to thank the Center for Deliberative Democracy and Global Governance for their intellectual support while writing the chapter. So for my chapter, the starting point is the severity of socioeconomic inequality generated by the capitalist economy. And we observe this by several longitudinal patterns of just how bad the gaps are between the super wealthy and the vast majority of the global population and populations within advanced industrial countries. Now, of course, income disparity isn't the only baseline for thinking about inequity generated by capitalism. A case could be made that everything impacting people's quality of life, ranging from child mortality, life expectancy, generational poverty, and social mobility, the access to very basic necessities like clean water, fresh air, affordable housing, healthy food, quality education, health-related services are wound within socioeconomic systems and structures. That I'm suggesting that contemporary democratic theory or work surrounding democratic innovation is not addressing head on. So in my contribution to the volume, along with some of my other work, I'm aiming to build on what Sonia and Adrian have written, along with some of our collaborative projects that Adrian and I are doing on the side as well. I put this background or context front and center and ask, how can participatory and deliberative governance decommodify social well-being? So the chapter aims to place capitalism at the center of the analysis, and not in a roundabout way, but to integrate the foundations of capitalistic relations and systems as a primary force that needs to be explained and redefined by democratic innovations. If we fail to fully capture the way that power is imbued within capitalist structures, and we remove political and public decision-making from the way that economies function and reproduce inequality, we eliminate the potential for democratic innovation to get to the very heart of how disparities and gaps that I just mentioned are created and recreated and ultimately addressed or mitigated. So I remind us about some important analytical concepts and research that we've sort of forgotten about that can help those of us interested in altering and reconstructing social relations. And these two interrelated concepts are decommodification and social well-being. I use Polanyi, Carl Polanyi and Gosta Esping Anderson as the analytical guides to sort of think through how democratic innovations might be transformative. So in my estimation, democratic innovations that aren't striving to decommodify social well-being, they aren't fulfilling their full potential. Processes that involve public decision-making should be trying to improve the quality of life of people in meaningful and measurable ways. And so how do we do this? How can we measure this? In the mid to late 20th century, there were a lot of debates surrounding how to use politics and policy to address the commodification of people's labor, of land and money. And these were couched within regulatory frameworks of a welfare state, some of which were more social democratic than others, including and along with civil, political, and social rights that came with things like shortened work weeks, unemployment insurance, sick pay, maternity leave, pensions. The idea was and is that if we decommodify these things, we could raise people's quality of life, reduce inequality, and elevate the rights of people. And much of this research, heavily focused on quantitative indices, of consumption of services as opposed to, say, self-development. And so these are formed around foundational pillars of what a welfare state is. In addition, this work was directly linked to thinking about democracy, but the type of democracy took public participation for granted, as voting for parties and elites. We learned how certain types of partisan cabinets produce more social investment than other regimes, but times have been changing, and even for the most progressive countries. So towards the end of the last century, which is carried forward, we sort of lost sight. And perhaps when I say we, I'm speaking to the deliberative and participatory democracy cloud, along with the policymakers of how to use democracy as a tool to achieve different types of decommodification. In fact, there has been increasing deregulation and commodification of important parts of our lives. Market forces have promoted the removal of controls and financial regulations. And so it raises questions about how we might rethink about decommodification and elevating social well-being from a participatory and deliberative lens, rather than only through legislatures and elected officials and political party mandates. How can the public more broadly be used to redefine the baselines of social well-being that are different from the post-war era, that are more relevant to the current era, that are including of social, political, economic, and environmental factors, and then how to achieve and implement those. So ironically, governments who are supporting and implementing the measures that are making people's lives much harder are in some ways aware of this, and they try to promote unique forms of community and resident mobilization to mitigate the worst aspects of commodification. So this is what Polanyi calls the double movement, which in a very limited, inarticulate way means to make things bad, only to intervene to clean up the mess in roundabout ways. So in what I note in the chapter is that these processes align with governance-driven democracy, as Mark Warren defines it, top-down implementation of democratic innovations. These are neighborhood planning tables in Toronto to correct for the misgivings of economic and social policies. So here the government gives a community development department the responsibility to generate empowerment in marginalized communities, to define what social well-being for each community is, and work with community partners to make inroads surrounding place-based objectives. So I recognize the good work that they do, but then there's also the bigger, broader political economy of the city in Toronto that circumscribes a lot of how this community development work can achieve what its objectives are. And it's a large task to achieve. But adjacently, there are other communities that are wise to the severity of the problems that they've been observing for decades, which have only gotten worse, and realize the structural nature of these problems, and they name these. And they seek to mobilize ways that go beyond the tools supplied by the government implemented democratic innovations. And they strive to fully govern themselves and remove aspects of the market from necessities like housing. So I refer to these in terms of what Sonia and Adrian note as democracy-driven governance. And here, one example is, the push for community land trusts, which are community governed and explicitly try to decommodify housing markets and alleviate poverty by giving marginalized people and the community more broadly housing stock that they can hold in perpetuity. And so interestingly, they use community-based research to inform their ability to act and draw upon democratic visioning sessions. The sort of contrast between top-down and bottom-up democratic innovations indicates, interesting work at the ground level in Toronto by street-level bureaucracy, but where the communities are most mobilized and they have their own democracy-driven community governance structures, we arguably see more potential to build embedded movements towards getting at the heart of the structures of capitalism that create homelessness, poverty, unemployment, unaffordability. And in fact, the neighborhood of Parkdale, in the variety of reports that they produce, they actually name verbatim that they're striving for a people's economy and for decommodification. So just to close up here we want to think about scaling and expanding these processes of democracy-driven governance, building collective learning and support for horizontal governance across other geographical areas. But like anything else with the word democracy in it, these processes face their own struggle and uphill battles. They face social contestation and larger economic forces. And I caution one of the main lessons of the decommodification literature is that shy of complete socialization, and so long as we're stuck with a capitalist system, we must continuously strive to implement varied forms of progressive decommodification. So how this feeds back to the volume, what earlier Sonia noted about institutional design, is we also need to expand our thoughts about what we mean by institutionalization. Because in contexts where there are no party politics, so for example, in Toronto, there are no parties, it's only individual candidates. How do you build progressive mobilization if there are no political parties to support these? So at the municipal level, how do we mobilize and embed then? And so what I'm suggesting here is we do this by providing different mechanisms first than what mainstream economics offers, empowering everyday people to regulate facets of economic processes that elevate social well-being. But we do this maybe at the neighborhood level, and this is probably one way to build the base of institutionalization and democratic control that you might not garner from political parties that can gain control of an entire council. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you for ending with such a powerful reflection and suggestion. So over to Lucy now. So just give me a second to share your slides, and then I'll hand over to you. And just again, give me some kind of warning when to move to the next slide.
Brilliant. Okay. I'll do that. Thank you, Diane.
Great.
I can just start while you get the slides set up. Just to say thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to be here. And to be part of this whole book project. I'm going to start with just a little word about where I'm coming from today. My background is in community development and community arts, and I've only relatively recently returned to academia after about 10 years working in local community development and community arts projects. So while I was working as a freelance musician with an arts organisation called Vox Liminis, I got the opportunity to do a practice-based PhD where we used collaborative songwriting among people affected by the criminal justice system and the asylum system in Scotland as a way to better understand people's experiences of systemic and societal injustices and complex pressures to integrate on those communities. So to put my cards on the table right from the start, I'm not a political scientist, but this PhD research was spread between 4 different academic disciplines, and that made me acutely aware of in-between spaces and how important they are, between people and communities, between academic disciplines, between arts and social science. And so that's why I was really delighted to be part of this book project and to be able to contribute something from a more arts-based perspective. And it's that kind of in-between perspective that I'd like to offer today. So what I'm going to do in this brief presentation is to just outline the chapter that I contributed to the book and offer a few thoughts to contribute to the broader conversation, which so far has been really stimulating. So my chapter is called Be Like Water, and it concerns the interplay between how we conceptualize the spheres of participatory arts and participatory politics. If you want to change the slide, Daya, that would be great. So the chapter recognises that participatory arts contexts and prefigurative social movements share significant common ground in terms of their values and their practices. They're both kind of loosely bordered contexts made up of shifting communities and networks. They're both in different ways pursuing social transformation, creating countercultural spaces, nurturing collective imagination, prioritizing relationships and mutual care, amplifying voices from the margins, addressing social inequalities. And they share a kind of language that talks a lot about process, about improvisation, inclusion, open-mindedness, and performance. They're also both contested spaces and spheres where utopian aspirations can make them very open to critique. But despite all of this common ground, my experience has been that these spheres are generally discussed and theorized in largely separate spaces. So the chapter seeks to map out some of this common ground and to question the boundaries that we create when certain practices are constructed as political or apolitical, and to consider how thinking together might benefit democratic renewal more broadly. I'll take the next slide. Thanks, Dio. So first of all, there's no question that arts-based interventions have played a vital role in enriching social movements all over the world through all sorts of art forms. But and so creative practice and artistic expression are often conceptualized as part of a kind of strategic toolkit within a movement. And the contribution of participatory arts to political goals can be a little bit more opaque and less easily identified in these contexts might not be explicitly political. But far from being apolitical, I argue that participatory arts practices have a different locus of politics, where art is not so much thought of as a toolkit to advance specific goals, as a way, but more as a way to include, value, and amplify voices and narratives from the margins that are frequently excluded from formal political participation. And here, inclusion in the making of the work is often thought to be as crucial as, or even more crucial than, the artifact that's created. I'll take the next slide. Thanks, Dio. The next section of the chapter is called Tyrannies and Entanglements, and it explores some of the various critiques of participatory approaches, both in politics and the arts. Over 20 years ago, Cook and Kothari talked about participation as the new tyranny. Yeah, that's definitely still resonating today. These critiques talk about participatory practices as offering a kind of veneer of equality that masks or even entrenches structural injustice, emphasizing the personal over the political, concealing power differences, or claiming emancipatory outcomes without real, deep critical analysis of the neoliberal context in which we're all situated. An example is the kind of top-down approach to commissioning participatory art under New Labour just after the turn of the millennium, which played a part in the shift in responsibility for social welfare from the state onto individuals and small-scale, local level and precariously funded projects. So in this section of the chapter, I also bring in these notions of governance-driven democracy and democracy-driven governance, which have already been mentioned today, because there are all sorts of parallels in publicly funded arts work between the kind of perhaps more bureaucratic approaches that generally serve the status quo and then spaces that take a more radical and critical approach. And what I think is interesting here about DDG, as we heard in Sonia's presentation, is its refusal to see this as a kind of binary where it's either or. Instead, it's taking a much more hybrid and complex approach where, and this is quoting Sonia and Adrian, invented spaces of citizenship interact with traditional institutions to transform porosity and complexity sets the tone for the rest of the chapter. I try to kind of problematize some of the binaries that are present in the conversations, in conversations about artistic and political participation. And I try to explore some of the ways in which participatory arts and prefigurative social movements, albeit often in different ways, are recognizing the complexity and porosity between these kinds of categories, often through attention to these in-between spaces. So on the next slide, it shows some of these binary oppositions. The idea of a kind of binary between political and apolitical, public and private, rehearsal and performance, present and future, short-term and long-term goals. There's a lot there. And I think both participatory arts contexts and social movement contexts are really putting in a lot of work to, I guess the complexity of and the oversimplification that's often present in these kind of binary categorizations. The chapter also has a series of short vignettes that reflect on participatory arts projects that I've been part of, just to try to bring a bit of colour to these more sort of theoretical discourses. So if I don't know how we're doing for time, I know that collectively we're maybe slightly over. Am I all right? I thought I'd take the opportunity to share some voices other than my own. And hopefully go some way towards illustrating the kind of complex politics that are present in participatory arts. So I'd like to play some excerpts from a podcast called The Art of Bridging. You can change the slide now, Dio, to the next one. So this is a podcast that emerged from a project called Distant Voices, which was a 5-year collaborative action research project doing songwriting projects in and around the Scottish criminal justice system. I know Oliver, who I think might be here today, was a big part of that project. He's also represented in the book, so hi, Oliver. So there's also a link here. The QR code would take you to the podcast in case you're interested in listening to more. But there should be a sound file embedded there, Dio. If you want to play that now, that'd be great.
Good question. I'm not.
Is it not showing up?
Lost?
Oh, maybe it's been lost along the way. Okay. Yeah. Well, let's not worry about that. I can send it to you.
Yeah, so if you can put it in the chat, and then people can.
I can put it in the chat. Yeah, that's a good idea. All right. So that's the end of my bit. But thanks very much for having me and for inviting me to contribute to the book. It's been a really stimulating experience, and I hope it's a conversation that we can carry on.
Thanks, Lucy. And I'm so sorry. I didn't realize there was an embedded file on. I'll be trying to sort it in the background. So I'm going to stop sharing and hand over to Paula.
Thanks, Dio. I wanted to try and do my share my screen, but I'm finding I think I don't have permission. I still don't have permission. So I'm just wondering, like, either I can do it also without slides. I also sent you the slides, Dio, if you, I don't know how quick that would be for you, or I'll do it without.
Let's have, you can start, and then if I get it.
Yes, I can, for sure. So my name is Paola Pieri, and I'm also one of the contributors to the book with a chapter that actually starts with a case study. I think, and I hope again for the conversation, this is going to be interesting and useful. I think I do bring a slightly different perspective on my case study on what is the role of like social movements and democratic innovation. My starting point in one of the first slides, oh, fantastic. Great. So if we can just go to the next one, is actually acknowledging that this work, this chapter, is very much a case study based on a case study that it was a longer project that engaged multiple cities that were working on issues of like climate change and towards just transition, and it had a very clear focus on participatory democracy and participatory governance specifically. And I just mentioned that in the slides. Of course, it's the work of many other people, not just myself. And I just have I've just been elaborating, and I have the pleasure and the opportunity to write about it. So next slide. The chapter and the work has a lot to do with the tension between democracy and climate action. And actually, whilst these two topics have been related by other scholars for a long time, what is becoming apparent, next slide, if I can ask you, Dayu, sorry, is that the climate crisis, and especially the way it has been framed, which has worked, of course, very well in terms of like the climate emergency and the need to act and to act very fast, has also highlighted a democracy crisis. Is really democracy even fit for purpose when it comes to address the climate emergency? Can democracy act and act fast? I mean, some people have been arguing that might not even be the case. If we can go to the next slide, just a little bit of background. I mean, the topic of like movements, like the climate youth movements that has been putting climate change at the top of the political agenda and the topic of democratic innovation have been two areas of work that, according to to some scholars, have been for some time even perhaps on opposing sides. Social movements doesn't work for democratic innovation, and democratic innovation can perhaps not learn from social movements. They work in very different direction and for very different purposes. But again, more recently, and increasingly, especially in climate change, I believe with the most recent climate change movements, this relationship has been framed as a much more nuanced one. And I think that's actually really interesting, and it would be great to expand and explore, I believe, even today, the different ways in which the movements can contribute to democratic innovation. But there's still very few examples of how this happens. And when institutional and democratic innovation occurs together or are linked to each other, to social movements on the other side. Next slide. In my case, I think, and the chapter in the book, of course, wants to contribute to and speak to this kind of need to perhaps have some more examples of that. And perhaps, and that's the added value, I believe, I hope from the chapter, to even kind of to look at the role of social movements when they actually influence or operate within more conservative governments. This is quite, I believe, a big topic. There's very little support from conservative governments towards climate action. So when it comes to social movements for climate change in that space, the need to actually act on and work with conservative governments in some way or in another is actually quite crucial, especially in environmental social movements. If we can look at the next slide, please. This is the case that I wanted to bring and I talk about in the book, and I'm not going to go into the details of what they did, but basically it's a case of, in France, of a municipal, actually a group of cities getting together, a metropolitan area, with the leading of the city of Orléans. Orléans had long tradition of climate inaction, so they were not acting on climate change. It's a long tradition of conservative governments, and also very slim, very little tradition of participatory democracy. They were listening and engaging citizens in very few occasions. So this was the context in which we were working. And as a result of a series of push from local social movements, which I'm going to tell you a little bit more in a second, actually they did organize in 2022 a series of events that was called the Orléans metropolitan area, this kind of assise for the ecological transition. If we can look at the next slides, I guess the question for me was and what I found particularly interesting of that case is that he was bringing the participatory governance, not in a city like Barcelona that we have been hearing about before, but in a city actually that had no experience of citizen engagement, very little climate action, and a long conservative government tradition. So that was, I think, the interesting, what made the case particularly interesting to me. And if we can look at the next slide, and actually maybe move also quite fast through the next 3 slides, sorry about that. I looked into democracy-driven governance, but I actually found that it wasn't really telling me what happens when social movements work in a political context that is less conducive to their action and to their issues. And therefore, I looked into another model that is from other authors that, of course, very much linked to the work that Sonia and Adrian have been doing, which is called empowered participatory governance. And I'm sorry for bringing all this kind of further acronym to the session. But what was really interesting from the work of Fung and Wright is that they actually talk about social movements in participatory governance playing a role as countervailing power. And we all, I guess, can picture that, and we've been hearing examples, but also as collaborative countervailing power, which I thought was the interesting and perhaps missing part in DDG. So if we can just look at the next slide, they have, and I'm not going to go into details, but they have a really interesting model. The idea of a countervailing power that is collaborative might seem counterintuitive or not logical, but actually they build on a series of cases to kind of make this model of what roles can social movements play as adversarial, and we've heard some examples, and that's crucial, but also as collaborative, and is what my case is more about. And in the next slide, again, we can go a bit faster through the next 3 slides. There are these 3 examples that I bring into the chapter of how, in my case, these kind of 3 things happened and materialized. So the first one is that these collaborative countervailing powers very much operate at a local level. They know the context, they know the people, they do push on political actors at a local level, they do make the most of the political opportunities. This was very much the case in Orléans, where they took an opportunity for an election, and local social movements that were, of course, related and linked to the transnational ecological movements. They made a difference locally in really pushing the local parties to sign a pledge that they were going to introduce more action around climate in their own programs. The coalition that won that electoral turn was in the end still a conservative coalition, but it was a conservative green coalition. So they had to start produce more work and actually open spaces like the Assis on green topics and on climate change. So this was a big shift locally. The second thing that, and we can move to the next slide, the second thing that these collaborative countervailing power bring is this idea that they have different sets of skills. They are, of course, like raising the issues, they are highlighting the problems that's fundamental from social movements, they are doing action, but they also do advocacy. They also push for things to be moved in different ways. And they also have very practical skills, trying to kind of focus and perhaps hint to what the solutions might be, not just framing and raising the problems. And I think, again, that is an interesting thing because it requires different skills and requires different capacity, and it did materialize in Orléans, which was really interesting to see. And then the next slide, of course, again, from Fang and Wright, from the authors of Empowered Participatory Governance, we learn these movements have less rigid frames, more like more hypotheses, and they work a little bit more experimentally on the ground. So they're much more able to adapt, and they demonstrate what I think was very visible in Orléans, a lot more pragmatism towards like what could be done now because of the climate emergency framing through a conservative government in a conservative context. So they actually really worked for piecemeal measures, not just for like the just transition, but they kind of identified things that were more doable in the current political context. And the need, of course, to develop new modes for institutionalizing their request. So this is, I believe, where the case was really interesting. The next slide, if we can look at that one, is just pretty much like what I think is the contribution. How can participatory governance happen in unusual places? This was an example from Orléans. And the next slide, if we can just look at that one, and it's my last slide, I hope I wasn't not too long, is a little bit giving you a sense of like what has happening. Of course, the Assis had all sorts of limitations, and in the chapter, I also highlight some of those, but it's still really interesting that in that context, again, you need to look at where we were starting from, this kind of conservative government with no climate action and with very little knowledge and understanding or practice even of participatory governance and citizen engagement. They had, after this kind of long-term process, 5 years plan for climate transition, a route map for action where they actually decided kind of clear steps to take, and a really interesting, I believe, accountability system. So they kind of put themselves under like a public scrutiny through this idea of guardians, I'm trying to translate, of the transition, which are identified through certification on a yearly basis. So it's different citizens, different actors that do take the role of like looking back and looking at the Orléans metropolitan area and what they're doing and whether they are on track or they aren't on their route map. And I thought that was actually quite interesting, again, in terms of like where we're now and what has been achieved. And that was my last slide. Thank you so much.
Hey, thank you so much. That was a really interesting case study. Thanks for sharing that with us. I'm now going to stop sharing and pass on to Greta for her reflections on what has been. I've made so many notes. So Greta, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you so much, Tayo. I want to start by thanking Sonia and Adrian for the invitation to be with you today, which also meant that I got like early access to the book. So I spent a lot of time reading all the articles and reflecting on these very, very important things. So thank you for that. I'm Greta Rios. I'm Mexican. I am the community building director at People Power. People Power is a global hub for participatory democracy. So basically what we do is we make sure that more and more of these processes happen around the world and that they can happen in a more successful way. We do a lot of resource sharing. We do a lot of experience exchange. So reading this book was very, very motivating to me. It made me feel like, you know, it's worth it. We're doing we're doing good for the world and we're getting there and we're not alone. So thank you for that, everyone. Also, I want to thank Nick, Lucy, and Paola for their brilliant presentations today. I found this book really refreshing in many ways, in particular because it mainstreams like a lot of very important concepts. So I wanna touch on a couple of them and then you know give the mic back to Dayo so we can have a nice conversation with questions and answers and maybe more questions than answers, but that's how research happens, right? Okay, so there's this very, very deep topic around social transformation. So there is like throughout the book, there is, you know, like hints of how much every author is really, really willing to commit or to make sure that whatever efforts that they are researching lead to deep social transformation. And my first question is whether participatory governance or participatory democracy actually deliver deep social transformation or not. So throughout the book, we see examples of how this is actually happening, and that is reassuring. But most of the examples we see in the book come from like very, very specific communities, from like small places or from pilots that are being run around the world. So the question is, how can we make sure that these pilots or these like very secluded experiences that are happening and that are giving us deep social change can translate into like a global movement of, you know, people with power in their hands to change the world and to shape their community. So that's the first one. So I think we've taken the first step, but how to make sure that this, you know, that this momentum does not dilute with the pass of time and with, you know, like all the awful things out there in the world that we deal with every day. There's also, you know, like a lot of reference to the decline of democracy, which is like an underlying thing that we all see every day. You know, people around the world do not trust democracy anymore, and actually, the thing that they understand when you talk about democracy is very different, I think, from what we understand as democracy and collective governance. So, for example, when I talk to my mom about, my mom's a chemical engineer. So when I talk to her about democracy, she thinks elections, right? And she thinks on how many times her heart has been broken by a politician who offered this and that and did not deliver. So how can we shift this message or this idea that democracy equals elections to the general public? No, how can we convey that it's us who make democracy, and that's the magic of democracy, and that's the magic of participatory governance, that we have the reins in our hands, and it's up to us to actually make, the right policy decisions. And I'm pretty sure people like my mom, who have technical instruction or like technical credentials on stuff, have a better say than maybe a legislator who has not heard about like chemical reactions or things like that, in very important things like climate change, for example, right? So how can we make sure that the common folks out there understand that it is their right, but it's also their obligation to participate and to shape the level of governance that we want. I also found a lot of mentions to the role of neoliberalism in the decline of democracy. So I would like to ask all of you here: is neoliberalism the enemy of democracy? Is this what we're fighting against, or is it just a consequence of late capitalism? Or like, what is the relationship between these neoliberal big regimes that we see around the world and that we saw in the 90s and in the early 2000s rise around the world, and what are the consequences on that, and how can we counter that, especially from a participatory way of thinking? Also, I saw a discussion happening about the watering down effects of participatory democracy or participatory governance, and how, for example, participatory budgeting in Porto Alegre started being a tool for social justice, which makes it like way, way, way stronger than what it is now, because now PB around the world is understood more as a tool for good governance, right? So there is a fundamental difference between social justice and good governance. So how did participatory governance and participatory democracy get diluted from something as important as a tool of social justice and social equality, and now it's just like a good governance thing, and like something you write in a report and people clap, like, oh yeah, we're doing great. But how do we lose our way, and most importantly, how do we get back that power, and how do we make sure that people understand that participatory governance is not something that's just like a trend that you adopt and you put a badge on your website and yeah, you're on the good side of things, right? Like, how is it making that people out there are the ones taking decisions and are the ones who are designing their governments? I really loved both Lucy and Paola's pieces on how art and like alternative approaches to participation or to participatory democracy can give voice to people who normally don't have it. And I would absolutely love to see more examples of this, because yeah, I mean, we live in a highly heterogeneous world, and I think that it's been proven that the normal models don't really give us the effects that we want. So how can we make sure that we include all the art movements and all the alternative ways of doing participation, and make it lasting, not just a one-off thing. I also believe that it's important. I know I have like 1.5 minutes, so I'm going to start speaking faster. The role of social movement in demanding a more participatory world. And I think that is one of the key elements of this book. It's not just about having a participatory approach that brings people in, but it's more like, hey, we need to listen to what the social movements are saying, and we need to make sure that we definitely are building a more participatory world. I love the examples that Nick gave us in his article from Toronto and Montreal, and I also love the example from Orleans about how it is happening around the world. But my question is, could there be mechanisms like this that we can apply at the national and regional levels to scale it up? And just to finish up, a question, where will these different approaches to participatory governance or to participatory democracy move in the following years? Do you foresee that there will be resistance from some governments, particularly from authoritarian governments? Could these social movements and could these ways of participation be co-opted by populism in the future? So these are just some reflections that I put on the table for all of us to discuss upon, and I'm giving the mic back to Dayo.
Thank you so much. I think you really captured quite a lot of the essence of the book and the contributions that were within the book. So thank you so much. I think there were loads of questions and loads of discussions, but I'm conscious that we want to bring the audience in. So I might just put 3 of the different kind of questions that Greta asked, and just kind of ask for volunteers about who wants to speak to what questions. And Greta, hopefully I got this right, but feel free to kind of correct me if I didn't. But I think the three key kind of questions to respond to is, how do we keep the momentum to ensure kind of deep social transformation? How do we scale up nationally, regionally? And then the final one, where do we see DDG going in the future? Do we envision resistance? Do we envision co-option, or actually is there some more hopeful forecast that people have? So I don't know who wants to, feel free to kind of unmute yourself and take, or maybe I should actually, I think I'll go to each of you, and then you can answer any of those 3 questions. And I'll start in reverse order. So Paula.
Okay, so I was actually thinking a couple of things. I mean, you were mentioning, Greta, that, it's becoming a trend, things where people want to have it as a badge. We're doing participatory governance. In our experience, that wasn't the case. I mean, in Orléans, we had those local movements, so local social movements had to make that case, actually, because for participatory governance and more participatory forms of like democracy to be on the agenda. So I was actually, and I've encountered more examples. So it's not the case, unfortunately, everywhere. It's not that popular yet. I also had a thought around the transformation question that you were asking before. I mean, we were working with different cities, and I have to say that some made way more progress than what Orléans did. But Orléans did the longest journey, because they started very much from a place where literally staff had no experience, no idea, no knowledge of methodology for, how do you create, how do you design, how do you measure, how do you set up a participatory process. They had never done it before. So it was literally like not just the political will, but also the civil servants having no experience and no knowledge of that. So in a way, maybe what they have achieved was not the most transformative in the end, but they did the longest journey. And I think that's what also made it really interesting, and something we should reflect more on. Last one, which is again not an answer. I believe the scaling is needed, and I believe it comes from this kind of transnationalism, internationalism, in connection between different movements. But in my case, again, what was really made a difference was the local movements that took the issues, were very much connected, took the language, the tactics from the international, but then they brought it to the local level. They made the most of the local opportunities. They mobilized the local resources. So there is a bit of a tension that I see there about, again, the need to scale through internationalism and transnationalism, but also the need to have that local grounding. In our case was key. I'll stop here.
Thank you. And then go back to Lucy.
Thank you, Greta. That was a really, a great kind of provocative set of thoughts and questions. And I don't even know really where to begin, but I've just jotted down 3 words, which are imagination, translation, and hope. So the first one, imagination. It seems to me that neoliberalism is such a pervasive, kind of all-consuming context. Kind of the market dictates everything, and in daily life, unless you consider yourself to be someone who is politically active or politically conscious, Many people have never heard the word neoliberalism or understand that there could be alternatives to it, and that it is a kind of deliberate system that's been put upon us. And when I think about family members that I have, or people that I know who are not kind of politically active, I think, how do we start to have these conversations about neoliberalism? And I think something that we maybe need to do is to help each other to imagine and envisage and mainstream what alternatives to neoliberalism might look like. Because I do think that this kind of late stage capitalism that we're in is an enemy to democracy. Also thinking about translation in terms of I guess taking these conversations out of the niches in which we all exist, whether that's academic or political or arts-based contexts. Often we get into very fine-grained detail in these kinds of contexts, like in today's conversation. But there needs to also be a translation process where we reach out to people who are different from us and who might not speak in that kind of language. But those conversations, I think, are really important. And the third thing is hope. You mentioned about feeling, I think you said that you felt like hopeful or energized by the conversation today and the stuff that you've been reading in the book. And I think it's really important to hang on to that, because a lot of the kind of post-truth political economy that we are seeing around us is based on fear and motivated by fear and trying to motivate people through fear. And I think if we can continue to be motivated by hope and curiosity in these conversations rather than by fear or distrust, then that also opens up new channels of communication and possibility for the future. I know that that's all very kind of vague and idealistic, but I hope that is a helpful thing.
Thanks, Lucy. I'm totally with you in the idealistic boat, so it's all good. Nick?
Yeah, thanks, Greta, for that. So much there to unpack. I guess the way I would talk about those three themes, and specifically in the context of Toronto, is that in terms of momentum, scaling up, and where DDG goes, I would say that there is momentum. I mean, in the last 5 years alone, we went from one community land trust to, within the last 3 or 4 years, 5 or 6 that have popped up. And now they are slowly buying up not only property to hold in communities that are facing serious gentrification, to potentially even becoming their own developers that are supposed to be held in perpetuity. And so this is an interesting sort of momentum that's gaining steam. I mean, it is happening in North America, where you're seeing the rise of community land trusts to deal with housing affordability crisis, which are so severe. And I think one way to think about, how you build that and maintain that momentum is to sort of think about the role of community engaged research in building upon governance structures that prioritize lived experience, collective dialogue, and things like that. And horizontal governance. I think one of the challenges there is that, the larger you build out DDG, the potential there is for bureaucratizing structures. And so it is one of a challenge that you might lose the sort of horizontal governance that you need to maintain the sort of DDG essence. And one way might be to separate how these larger structures, as you scale them, look like in terms of operations versus, key meta decisions about how a community moves forward. And so one thing might be, operations versus, larger decisions. And in terms of avoiding co-optation, I think governance frameworks are important to put people front and center, to make sure that they're able to sort of retain the power to be able to sort of regulate, certain aspects of what DDG means in their specific context.
Thanks, Nick. Sonia and Adrian, I don't know if you want to come in, or whether we open it to questions, or if you want to come in for like 30 seconds each.
I can see that, there's a few questions already, but I wanted to engage with Greta's question, like, can participatory governance actually deliver any social transformation or not? And I think this is that question, right? where I see possible changes, so there's radical Democrats, right, like Sheldon Walling, that says that the institutionalization of participation in a polity that is dominated by corporation with unprecedented economic and political inequality, it just like this status thing just precludes any genuine opportunities for inclusive participation and tangible change. But then there's also the participatory Democrats with like Carol Pateman that says, actually, it is important to continue to strive for institutional change and democratization of diverse spheres of life, and not just centers of power and policymaking, but the workplace, the school, the family, right? And I think that's the difference, that democracy-driven governance really acknowledges the critique advanced by radical democratic theory, but also embraces the challenges for institutionalization supported by participatory democracy. And I think what is interesting about a lot of the grassroots initiative that happened, particularly in the context of new municipalism in Spain, but not only, is that really they just move away from a focus on just legislator and politicians, and they actually try to defetishize markets. So what they're trying to do is replacing relations among commodities with social relations, and recognizing that you can't decouple the practice of democracy and politics from socioeconomic constraints, which is the error that the democratic sector and the fields of democratic innovation has been doing for a long time. And I think this has been pointed out by a lot of the speakers as well. And I think, there are a number of challenges, because a lot of the economic and political decisions that we want to make change is actually hardwired in laws, regulation, fiscal arrangements, and these are invisible often to activists, and they sort of clash against this framework once they start engaging with the state. But we're also seeing very innovative things like public commons partnerships, right, that are actually trying to democratize public administration and inventing new instruments that allow the commons to manage and deliver public services and manage public assets, or things like community wealth building. That is an approach that links public procurement to the local economy, giving space to cooperative and social enterprises. And so I think it's a way of expanding democracy beyond the mini publics or participatory budgeting, prioritizing a few ideas from the local neighborhood. And there's also progressive translational networks like the Fearless Cities that are trying to create connections and share learning. And I think the challenge is how we can facilitate and support these networks of change. And I'll leave it here, but it's a great discussion, and thank you everyone for their contribution.
Thanks, Sonia. Adrian, did you want to come in?
I think probably I have some things to say, but it's probably best to take some questions at this point. Maybe I can weave those things in later.
Thanks for that, Adrian. We are now at a point where we would love questions from the audience. So please either raise your hand if you want to pose a question. And I guess while people are maybe still formulating questions in their minds or before they raise their hands, I will go to the question in the chat from Josh Key, and I'm going to read it out. So he said, they said in German, many recent citizens' assemblies are clear in their objective to not take any decision-making power away from officials. I think this might be strategic, since these are the same officials greenlighting the assemblies. But what do you make of this? And what examples can you point to where people are taking a different strategy and finding success? I'm conscious that there are other contributors to the volume in the room. So Hendrik, I think Albert, Patricia, apologies if I've missed anybody out, but you're very welcome, Marina, very welcome to as well contribute to this Q&A as well. So did anybody want to take that? Or Hendrik, did you have a question? You have a
Great. I have a question. So
You have a question.
yeah.
Okay, so once someone responds to Josh's, then we'll come to you, Hendrik. Did someone in the panel have a sort of straight away response to the question that Josh has posed to us?
Dayo, if you want, we can, since we're running out of time, we can take a few questions together, and then we can have another round of comments so that we can hear more voices. Yeah.
Okay,
thanks.
Hendrik.
Yeah, thank you. Well, first of all, I have to say that I'm very, very happy that I was part of this book. It was an incredible journey, and it has been continued in a sort of way with Sonia participating in a special issue in the comments, and with Adrian, I had an exchange on economic democracy, which hopefully will continue. But what I came away with the book, and after I've read some more chapters and this continuing work, is a couple of things, and that they all speak to the last point. So how do we go on with developing democracy-driven governance? And one thing is that, and the book has it less than many other things that I read in this field. One thing is that you see a persistent localism bias and let's call it a positive bias. So we feel good because there are all these wonderful initiatives and they have so much potential. But then when I look at the environment in which those initiatives and those small local projects are launched, it's quite appalling, actually. I mean, Nick already drew attention to it. We're working in a very, very hostile political economy with huge amounts of power. I'm teaching policy analysis, so I just taught Luke's 3 dimensions of power again, so I'm sensitized to power. But it is all around us, and so what can we do to come up with a kind of research program where we hold on to the ideals of participation in the face of this kind of political economic realism? And I think just an idea that I have that we should maybe at some point, we don't have to do it now, but we can talk about. I think we need a lot more comparative research where we compare successful cases or not unsuccessful cases, and do it with a kind of large and qualitative research design. So meaning that you have lots of observations that you then systematically analyze through inductive forms of analysis like grounded theory. We did that in a study at the University of Vienna called SOLPAN, Solidarity in Times of Pandemic, and we had a sample of 950 interviews in 9 different countries, and we asked many questions to that data set. That was remarkably insightful, and because comparative research tells you so much more than just looking at one case, or and with large and qualitative research, you both have the power of comparison and the power of digging deep into the qualitative processes that the cases give you. So that's I just want to stay with that. There's a lot more to say, but I think one of the great things that the book does is just trigger these kinds of ideas that you get as a researcher in how we can continue. And again, I'm very, very happy that I was able to be part of this, and that the conversation continues. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Hendrik. Are there any other questions before I hand back to our panel speakers? Any more? Either raise your hand or put in the chat. Okay, so I will go to Adrian first this time to respond to Josh's question and also Hendrik's comments, and then a question around, how do we continue this work in the face of powerful political economic forces?
Thanks. Yeah, I'm not sure I can speak directly to Josh's question. I don't know the case very well. Maybe I can do so in a roundabout way with Henk's question around where do we go from here, and this localism bias and this sort of positive bias in spite of this unchanging context, which is, you know, what DDG is trying to change. It's also related to the three issues, the third that you summarized from Greta. So where does DDG go? I think in terms of the sort of the context, I think there's, you know, cooptation or expansion, I think we said. I think that's a bit of a false dichotomy, because, you know, change does happen through expansion and cooptation. I don't want to get too abstract, but one of the things that makes the power of the political economy that we live in so hard to deal with is that it enmeshes us into it in ways that our needs and wants and the needs and wants of organizations and the state are satisfied as it grows, are increasingly satisfied through the circulations of capital. So it perpetuates it. And that's a big issue. But cooptation, and that creates cooptative power at a systemic level. It can be instrumental, but it creates cooptative power at a systemic level. But there's dynamism in cooptation. Cooptation is a two-way thing. It's not assimilation. The system also has to make changes in its form to make cooptation legitimate, right? And I think a key litmus test here, which could give us a compass, is provided by Nick's chapter. Does it decommodify? Does it create spaces of freedom outside of capital circulations and commodification? Some thinking I like on this is Eric Colin Wright, How to be an Anti-Capitalist in the 21st Century. And he talks about change not coming out of one strategy. That was the Leninist issue, smashing capitalism. And it's too much to ask DDG to do that. So he talks of different actors with different strategic orientations towards capitalism, whose distributed agency through different strategies, which he assumes as taming, resisting, dismantling, escaping capitalism. We could talk about those things in more detail, I won't go on. But they sort of combine into maybe eroding capitalism and creating more freedom outside it. And then that sort of links into the momentum point. I think that's very important. Sonia mentioned Sheldon Woolin. He talks of democracy as fugitive, because lots of times DDG speaks to the attempt to continue what we could call democratic moments, where it's characterized by lots of citizen activity that's really hard to sustain, because collective action is very hard to sustain. So I guess part of the wager of DDG is that by institutionalizing participation, it carries through some of that momentum, or at least lowers the cost of continued collective action. And in this sense, I think thinking of participatory governance in terms of what power resources it gives to civil society and progressive social movements, it is really important. And then some work led by Sonia on embedding is crucial as well, which I participated in. And I think that leads to how we scale up. With good embedding, the scale question might also be solved. And I haven't solved this, but I think a good example is the classic example of Porto Alegre, which I'm beginning to sort of refocus on. And one recipe there, and this doesn't speak to the large N research that Henk calls for. I'm sorry, I can't answer that. But there was I can see a dynamic there between win-win situations that were generated by a political party that gained electoral advantage from a process which also gave material gains to civil society associations, which fed that electoral advantage. And as long as the material gains were being delivered, civil society associations continued organizing around the process. Civil society thickened out, and it generated an organic bottom-up form of democratic development, which embedded for a while and then disembedded, probably with the issue of scale. as the PT, Partido de los Trabajadores, entered the national level, and as it lost local power, that demonstration effect that kept people participating for the material gains they achieved started to wane. New leadership started to wane, and at the bottom, and they also transferred to the top as the PT entered national government. So we have a partial recipe for embedding and keeping momentum from one case. So nothing like Henk's great idea for comparative large N research, but I think that might be where we could start. And sorry if I went on too much.
No, thank you so much, Adrian. I'm just conscious of time. And so to respect everybody's time, I'm not going to go back to the panel. And I was going to ask for an answer to Josh's question, but I've just seen that Nick has responded. So really, thank you for doing that, Nick. Really appreciate that. So I'm just going to end now and just want to say thank you to all the contributors for sharing your thoughts, for Greta for sort of your insightful conversations and lots of kind of provocations that have been put out for us to to ruminate on, to think about, to influence future research as well, I would say. Thank you to the audience for your time, for the questions that have come through, and just want to wish you all, Adrian? Yeah, just want to wish you all a good evening. But Adrian had his hand up, so I'm going to pass over to Adrian.
Just very quickly, I wanted to recognize the work of others that have contributors here that also relate to some of these issues. So Albert worked on a chapter which looked at how the Decidim online platform was taken up or wasn't, and the politics behind that, and the kind of political incentives behind why administrators and politicians take up these processes. And then in terms of keeping up momentum, I think at a sort of micro level, Patricia's chapter, which focuses on the frustration that activists have as they engage in DDG, is really crucial. She focuses on the relational goods that activism produces as a motivator for further activism. And maybe DDG depletes that because it asks activists to engage with the state. And in this sense, maybe ETG, which I think, sorry, I've forgotten, Paula talked about, might be a better model in that respect, because it's not about moving into the state, it's about countervailing power outside of the state. That might be more satisfactory and a better division of labor for activists. And then also Marcus Holder's work on democratic care and thinking about caring for participants and between and within activists as a way of sustaining these things is crucial, linking to Patricia's chapter as well.
Great, thank you so much. And yeah, so thanks everybody for staying with us for a few minutes past 4:30, and enjoy the rest of your evenings, everyone. Take care. Thank you
very much, Dio, and thank you everyone for your contribution and questions. It's been a pleasure to work with all the contributors to the volume. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, guys. Thank you very much.
Pleasure to be here.
Thanks,
Have
everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Nick, I'll react.
Thanks. Take care.